Allow me to add my good morning to you and my happy new year as well. It's great to be with you this morning. You know, I know that a lot of you have been in my office before, but if you've actually taken a few minutes to kind of snoop around my bookshelf, I actually have most of my books are still in my office at home, but if you were actually to take some time and do some snooping around my bookshelves, you would notice that I have very few self-help books. And I know that self-help books continue to be some of the best-selling published books on the market today, but I have to confess that I really have very little patience for them. And these are some of the reasons why. These are some of the more ridiculous self-help books that have actually been written. So this first one is called, drum roll please. Yep. This one is called Things I've Learned from Women Who've Dumped Me. This next one is called Faking It. How to Seem Like a Better Person Without Actually Improving Yourself. I don't know if that alcohol has something to do with it, but the next one, How to Be Funny, Interesting, and Make People Like You, the Fastest Way to Make Friends. The next one, The Funny Thing About Homework, the hilarious guide to cutting homework time in half. One of my personal favorites, Shut Up, Stop Whining, and Get a Life by Larry Winget. Another one, Why Men Don't Have a Clue and Women Always Need More Shoes, the ultimate guide to the opposite sex. And probably my favorite, I need to tell you that this next book is Andre's second most favorite book. And it is actually a Christian self-help book. And it's called Anybody Can Be Cool, but Awesomeness Takes Practice. There you go. Andre's going to teach a small group through that. Well, he's got pretty good hair, doesn't he? Yeah. What is so interesting about all of these books and the millions of other self-help books that really do flood the market every year is that they all promise to help pull people out of personal ruts and promise to help heal broken relationships and promise to help people find happiness. And if you're just willing to follow a few simple steps, then your life can be so much better. And therein lies the problem that I have with these books. Because you see, most of the problems that we face, that you and I face, are not simple, few-step solution types of problems, are they? In fact, most of the issues that we face are much more complicated than these books seem to make them. And all of these books tend to try and give us short and easy answers to problems whose solutions really are anything but short and easy. Likely won't surprise you to hear that most of the self-help books on the market today, in fact, almost 71% of them are on relationships. And most of those books focus on our family relationships and our relationship with our spouse or our kids, relationships with our aging parents. And I guess the question that I want to start off with this morning is, why do you think so many people are buying these books that promise to make these struggling and fractured relationships better? Well, the answer is maybe quite simple. It's because we live in a world where family relationships just really are not functioning the way that they should. And we live in a world where husbands and wives come into marriage with expectations that seem like they never get met. And because we live in a world where family relationships so easily become fractured, and people become siloed, and people become so frustrated that they just, in fact, stop trying. I'd love to be able to stand up here and tell you that those of us who follow Jesus, those of us who are committed to living the kind of life that he calls us to live, that all of us are really exempt from that. But as we know, that's simply not the truth. Well, today we're going to be starting a short 3-week series that we're calling Modern Family. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about God's design for our modern families. And we're going to look at some great teachings, most of which is found in the book of Colossians, especially focusing on Colossians chapter 3. But this is what you need to understand up front, is that Colossians is not a self-help book. There's no follow these 5 steps to have a happy family. The solutions to real challenges are not simplified or dummied down in any kind of way. Now, that's not to say it doesn't provide hope for those who are feeling maybe disconnected and find themselves in a family situation that's going nowhere fast. But before we dive into this text, we first need to understand something about the church that Paul was writing to in Colossians. Paul was talking to predominantly Roman families, and these Roman families had grown up in the Roman culture that really did not value the same things that Jewish culture and the new church families did. So Paul's teaching in this passage is really intended to be 2 things. First of all, it's intended to be theological in the sense that people needed to shift how they were thinking. But it was also intended to be very practical because these families were struggling, and these families needed help, and they needed it now. The church that Paul was speaking to was in some ways maybe a lot like Willowlake, in that it had a lot of different families that had come from different places. And there were different cultures really under the same roof that called themselves this church family. And with that came different thoughts on the role of husbands and the role of wives and expectations on the behavior of kids. But we do know that it was predominantly made up of Roman converts to Christianity, and that in and of itself provided a lot of challenges to this church. For example, in Roman families, the role of the father was very different than the role that fathers have today. In fact, the father was the absolute head of the household, and he single-handedly had absolute authority over everything and everyone under their roof. The role of the mother was also very different in that she was seen as someone who was completely subject to the whims of her husband. Even legally, she had very few rights back then. In fact, I found this fascinating. According to the Roman law, a wife could only divorce her husband in the case that he caught leprosy. Isn't that interesting? The only reason she could divorce her husband was if he were to come down with leprosy. There's also historical documents that record that at certain times in the Roman Empire, that after a woman would give birth to a child, that she was legally obligated to take that newborn in her arms and actually put it at the feet of her husband. If he picked it up, the baby would live, and if he didn't, well, the baby would be taken away to die. In Roman families, the role of kids was also very different than the role the kids would have today. Children were legally the property of their father, and they could technically be sold, discarded, as however the father saw fit. And if they didn't please the father, then they could and often would be sold as slaves. So get this, an average Roman family would often shoot to have about 6 kids. But statistically, only 3 of them would still be living with the family and acting as part of that family by the time they turned 16. And understand that this is the culture that made up most of the people from this young church. And as they were trying to figure out their way through this new faith in Jesus and what it meant, and as they were trying to understand Jesus' teachings, and they were sincerely wrestling with the culture that they had come from and what that culture had taught them, they were looking to Paul for answers. They were asking him to help them sort out their family issues. And they wanted to know how to integrate this newfound faith that they had with every aspect of their family life. You know, as I was preparing for this week, I found myself thinking if there was ever a group of people that would have loved a self-help book, maybe a simple 7-step guide to becoming a godly family, it likely would have been these Roman families. But that is not what Paul is about to offer them here. Because Paul knew that these were big issues and that becoming families that followed after Jesus' teachings and glorified him in the way that they functioned. That these people didn't need a step-by-step guide. They needed to align their whole lives with what God wanted for them. And that really is the whole purpose behind the book of Colossians. Let me try and put this another way. Have you guys heard of the game Jenga before? Well, if you haven't, Jenga is, the object of Jenga is actually to remove blocks from a stack of blocks one at a time and place them on top of this tower without knocking them down. In fact, I'm going to show you the first TV commercial for the game that came out in 1987. Take a look at this.
What's this?
Huh? Oh, it's nothing.
Nothing?
No. Okay, it's a game, Jenga. But
how do you
please
play?
Don't get started. You take a piece off the bottom, you put it on the top. But don't. Eat, talk, circulate. Don't play the game.
Come on, Charlie. You got the fastest hands in the room.
Yes. Food. Limbo contest.
Careful.
That's the best move I've seen you make all night, Helen.
Alan, no Jenga again. Alan!
I wasn't playing. I swear.
Jenga. Once you touch it, you can't keep your hands off it.
So it starts off easy, right? Because blocks come out easy and there's lots of different ones to choose from. But as the game progresses, it gets increasingly more difficult. Because your tower starts to lean and it rocks from side to side, and eventually it becomes unstable. And when that happens, players have to be extra careful to make the right decision about which block to remove. And even then, sometimes the blocks come tumbling down. So why am I telling you about this game? Well, in a sense, this is what Paul is trying to get across to the people in this church about their most important relationships. He's saying that when you think about building a strong family and strong relationships, and when you sit back and ask why you're not happy or why your relationships might be filled with pain and misunderstandings and feelings of disconnection, it's likely that the building blocks haven't been strong enough to keep your tower from crashing in. And in the book of Colossians, Paul is giving the church the necessary building blocks to have the kind of growing and God-glorifying relationships that God really designed for us as his followers to have with each other as well as within the family. And this, understand, this is not an easy self-help process. What Paul is talking about takes a lot of personal soul searching and a personal willingness to grow and change ourselves. So when we come to chapter 3 of Colossians, Paul has already spent 2 chapters talking about how important it is that we put Christ at the center of our life. And now in this chapter, Paul's turning his attention to the family. And in essence, he's saying here that if I'm placing Christ first in my life, it will demonstrate itself in my home. So Colossians chapter 1, Paul shows us how important it is that Christ is head of the church. In chapter 2, he's talking about Christ and the importance of him becoming like a treasure in our lives. And in chapter 3, that we're going to be camping out in for the next few weeks, Paul's showing us that Christ really needs to be a target that we're striving for, aiming for. In fact, the whole theme of the book of Colossians is really found in Colossians 3:11. And it says that Christ is all and is in all. He's at work in our church. He's at work in our relationships. He's at work in our families. And then comes the real convicting part, at least convicting for me, the convicting part of this conversation. Because Paul's really, when you boil it all down, Paul's asking the readers this question. He's saying, are you really willing to allow Christ to work in you? If you're having problems with your kids, are you really allowing Christ to work in you? If you're having problems with your spouse, are you really willing to allow Christ to work in you? And maybe you're sitting there and saying, but I'm not the problem. My spouse is the problem. And to that, Paul is saying, are you really willing to allow Christ to work in you? The 3rd chapter of Colossians is often called where the rubber meets the road chapter, because Paul's giving families in this church 5 building blocks or reminders that are intended to strengthen their most important relationships, both, again, within the church as well as within the families. And we want to spend the remainder of our time looking at those building blocks this morning. So firstly, Colossians chapter 3 starts off with this reminder that they've been called to a new way of living. And this new way of living is supposed to impact every situation, every interaction, and every relationship that they have. He starts off in verse 1, and he says this. He says, "Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory." So he's telling people that since they've already had this life-altering encounter with Jesus, where they've identified with him being raised from the dead, that it's time for them to start thinking and acting differently. He says to them, set your hearts on the things above. And Paul's reminding them that they need to keep their eyes on the prize. And when their hearts and their passions and when those things that drive us are all focused on these healthy and wholesome spiritual things, then truthfully, we don't have a lot of time for petty things that so often derail our relationships and cause them to sink. He says, set your hearts on the things above. But he also says, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And I think Paul, when he says this, is reiterating what he says to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians 10, when he says to them, we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Now let that sink in for just a minute, because I do believe it's true of all of us. When we're able to set our hearts on the things above and set our minds on things above, what impact would you expect that to have on your most important relationships? I mean, all of a sudden our focus becomes much more, I would say, bigger picture, and our scope becomes much wider, and we can't afford to get caught up in small, petty things because we're so focused on how to flesh out what it means to have Christ actually work in us and through us. So that's the first building block. The second building block is found starting in verse 5. And Paul is reminding them in this passage that they've been called to put to death their earthly nature. He says, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And he goes on to list some of those things. You know, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, the greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. He says you used to walk in those ways, in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge in the image of its creator. Here there is no Jew or no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. You know, a better translation of that phrase, put to death, in the original Greek would actually be to mortify your members. Isn't that interesting? And it actually is saying that we need to deprive those old ways of life of its power. He's saying to mortify them, to kill them, to suppress them, to weed them out like you would pick weeds out of your garden. Paul is saying all that is part of who you used to be. That's what you used to do. It's part of your old self before you had your encounter with Jesus. But now you have been called to something completely different than that. And listen again to the language he uses. Put to death your earthly nature. You used to walk in those ways in the life you once lived. You've taken off your old self with its practices. You have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge, in the image of its creator. Paul's really saying, let the change that has happened to you through Christ be reflected in the daily choices that you make, not to slip back to what you used to be like. You're not like that anymore. You know, we don't like to admit this, but really, part of what Paul is reminding us of is that there's no such thing as a personal sin. And I'm wondering, do you believe that? I mean, maybe there are some sins that nobody else will see or nobody else will find out about, but sin is never only personal, because sin changes you, sin limits you, sin affects your relationship with Christ and your relationship with others. And this is part of the point that Paul is trying to make here. If you want a strong family life, and you want a strong relationship with your spouse and a strong relationship with your kids, and if you want a stronger marriage, he's saying whatever belongs to your earthly nature, just take it off. The third reminder that Paul's giving them is simply put, and I love the picture that this provides. So you've been called to dress for success. Verse 12, therefore as God's chosen people, holy and clearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has grievances against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. I just love the visual picture here of clothing yourselves in these qualities. He's saying get dressed in these qualities and wear them throughout your day, wherever you go and whatever you do and whoever you interact with, no matter what your day might bring. He's saying let these qualities be as identifiable to people as what you choose to wear. When he says clothe yourselves with compassion, the literal translation of this, and I love this, is clothe yourselves with the bowels of compassion. And it was interesting. It was worded that way because the ancients believed that at the core of all human emotions, they were located in the lower abdomen area. So he's saying, clothe yourselves with such deep compassion for people that you feel it way down in your abdomen. That's the third. The fourth building block, he's reminding them, and it starts in verse 17. He's reminding them that as followers of Jesus, we are called to create peace. And you are called to be a peacekeeper and a peacemaker. Verse 15, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. And be thankful, let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom and psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in our hearts. I heard an interesting story a few weeks ago about two artists that were actually asked to paint their depiction of what peace was. One artist painted this beautiful scene of a lake in the midst of this beautiful field of grass and flowers and trees. And the other artist painted this thundering waterfall with this tiny bird holding onto a branch stretching over the waterfall. So one of these pictures depicted peace as being a state where your circumstances are all under control and nothing around you is erupting. But the other picture depicted peace as being a state of mind where no matter what is thundering around you, there is a peace. There can be a peace that surpasses all understanding. And most of our families will go through those thundering, loud waterfalls. I mean, maybe it's personal conflict. Maybe it's related to sin. Maybe it's related to illness, or maybe it's financial. Maybe it's problems with your in-laws. Life will not always be like that serene setting of a lake where everything is sunshine and roses, as a lot of you know. What this passage is really talking about, though, is the kind of peace that's experienced when Christ is at the very center of our lives. This is the kind of peace that happens when your mind and heart are set on the things above. This is the kind of peace that happens when you are daily working to put to death your old earthly nature. It's the kind of peace that happens when you are clothing yourselves with compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. When you're covering all of those things with love that binds them all together with perfect unity. And that peace is the byproduct of striving to become who God intended you to be. And it's a peace that exists no matter what circumstances might be happening around you. The final building block that's talked about here in this passage is simply put, you're called to a life in which everything you do is done as an expression of gratitude towards God. Okay, I get this is a really deep thought, but please just for a moment allow this to sink in what this means. Because what Paul is saying here is that if our lives were to be so aligned to being who God wants us to be and doing what he wants us to do and saying what he wants us to say and living how he wants us to live and treating others how he wants us to treat them and loving our spouses how he wants us to love them and raising our kids how he wants us to raise them. If our internal compass is so aligned to living that kind of life, how do you think your most important relationships will look different? Verse 17, and whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. If you've heard nothing else this morning, take this with you. Because I think this passage is telling us that in most cases, maybe not all, but in most, the issues that we face in our family relationships are not the problem, but they represent the symptom of our own inability to put God in his rightful place in our lives. My friends, there's no easy solutions. There's no 5 steps to work through, no 150-page self-help book that's going to help you to navigate what you may be going through right now. There's no self-help book that can heal broken relationships and turn broken families into healthy ones, growing one overnight. And Paul is certainly not prescribing any kind of a secret formula for how we can have these successful relationships. But what he is doing is telling this very diverse church that when they as individuals learn to set their own personal compass to God's true north, and when we set Christ as the cornerstone of our lives, then all of those other things that typically pull families apart will not have the power to do so. You know, Mother Teresa was once given a platform at the United Nations to speak to the people that were there, and she stood up. And the question that she was supposed to address was, what can you do to promote world peace? Some of you might have heard this before, but she got up there and said, what can you do to promote world peace? She said, go home and love your family. I'm going to close with this story. It's an old rabbinical story about how the spot was chosen for God's holy temple. You know, 2 brothers worked a common field and a common mill, and each night they divided whatever grain they had produced, and each took his portion home. One brother was single, and apparently the other was married and had lots of kids, had a very large family. And the single brother decided that his married brother with all those kids certainly needed more grain than he did. So at night, he secretly crept over to his brother's granary and gave him an extra portion. The married brother realized that his single brother didn't have children to care for him in his old age, and he was concerned about his brother's future, so he got up every night and secretly deposited some grain into his brother's granary. One night they met halfway between the 2 granaries, and each brother realized what the other was doing. And they embraced, and as the story goes, God witnessed what happened and said, this is a holy place, a place of love. And it is here that my temple shall be built. The holy place is that spot where God is made known to his people, the place where human beings discover each other in love. And you know, it's my prayer that we would all accept that challenge of making our families into that holy spot where God is made known. And it all starts with you. Let's pray. God, thank you. And thank you that as we came in here this morning that you are well aware of those things in our lives that maybe aren't the way that they should be. You're aware, Lord, of families here that are struggling, of some of us that are just struggling with relationships with people within our families. And I thank you for the challenge that we've had from Paul and some of the words that he spoke to the church in Colossians. And I thank you that there is so much power and truth in those words. Father, you see our hearts. You understand us better than we understand ourselves. And it's my prayer that this morning that each of us would be able to take, maybe even it's just one thing from your word. Allow us to apply that to our lives and allow it to make our relationships and our families stronger, Lord. In your name we pray.